Welcome, everyone, and it's just a great honour to have been asked to present to you today the Mechanical Recording Workshop, Operatic Voice Study. I would like to acknowledge that both Anna and I are on a special country here in Australia, in Sydney. It's the Gadigal country of the Eora Nation, and we both pay our respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging of the Gadigal people. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Barbara Gentili and Dr. Ines Stanovic for inviting us to this wonderful conference and workshop. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what we've been doing as part of a research project here in Sydney. And we're up to a stage in the project. It's to do with bel canto, where Anna and I have been looking at expanding expressive possibilities in Schubert's Lieder, particularly using early recordings and documentary sources. And I want to acknowledge straight up that, in the world at the moment, there's such an impressive range of artistic creative research going on. We have such great networks around through the UK, through Switzerland, in Australia, and it's wonderful that we're all working in similar areas and garnering new knowledges using innovative techniques and processes. And particularly because there's a lot of practical experimentation going on with performing practice evidence in new ways, I think, nowadays, and we're breaking down the old silos that I think developed in the 20th century. And I really don't want to insult anyone by saying that, but that's something that I've really come to think about the work that's been done so far, that there are still silos that we need to deal with. And the really wonderful part of the work that we're all doing is this increase of artistic imagination that's going on, the variety that comes to performance, the expressive possibilities, and just a whole range of experimentation and being courageous with that as well. And it's really, in this project, it's all in aid of coming to understanding what rhetorical or declamatory delivery in singing and piano playing was during the 19th century and even into the 18th century from what we can tell from the evidence. So that's what we're going to be talking to you about today. Our study is part of an Australian Research Council funded what we call a discovery project, and the title is The Shock of the Old, Rediscovering the Sounds of Bel Canto 1700 to 1900. That's a big thing to be doing, and we're getting there, and we're very excited about the work that's happening. Our creative research pillars, which we've developed partly to mitigate current boundaries in singing and piano playing, are kind of in 4 stages. So you'll all have heard of emulation and imitation of recordings, of old recordings. This is really to discover what it's like to use the techniques and the expressive devices that we hear on the recordings of musicians trained in the 19th century. We're also grappling with this new area of music research, embodiment, where it's using the body and developing new and individualized expressive vocabulary. So our experiences that we've already had to understand what's going on and to embody them. And then the third technique is this practical cyclical experimentation where we look at the documentary evidence and we extrapolate styles and practices by experimenting between our practical results and the documentary evidence. Constant reevaluating what we've done. Do we think are we getting close to a result that we would like? And by that, we are honing the results. And through that, we have the creation of new knowledge, and it's through active collaborative performance trials and critical listening in both as individuals, but also in group situations. I'd like to introduce Anna Fraser, who's a dear friend of mine, first of all, but also Anna is a really wonderful professional, world-class singer who has spent a lot of her time working on historical repertoire, but also importantly in the contemporary music field. She has operas and things written for her, or parts in operas written for her by living composers. She's currently a Doctorate of Musical Arts candidate. That's our sort of performance doctorate at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music, and she's very graciously agreed to come because so much of the work we're doing here is based on what she does as a vocalist and her thinking behind the work. So we're reimagining a Schubertian sound world today, and Anna will talk a bit later on. So I'd like to jump into this wonderful, really, it's a drawing from 1868 of Schubert and arguably his favorite singer, Vogel, at the house of Baron von Spaun in Vienna, and it was drawn from memory by a friend of theirs, Moritz Ludwig von Schwind, in 1868. And you see Schubert at the piano and Vogel sitting next to him, and they're singing, and obviously the group of people around them, who are all friends and aristocratic people, are enthralled with the music making that they're hearing. You can see on their faces elegiac looks and sighs and all sorts of things. So when I see this, it's very inspiring, of course. And Clive Brown, who you'll all have heard of, half of the people here are actually related to his wife. So it's got a closeness to me. They have this picture actually hanging in their drawing room in Vienna, and we've talked about it a lot. But the question is, how might what they were singing have sounded in performances? So how did the composer and his admired singers sound to audiences of the time? And how can our historical and artistic research inspire and support individual artistry in classical and romantic era music making? That's what we're delving into. At the top of this slide, I've got here a quote from a letter from Schubert to his brother Ferdinand in 1825, where he extols his enthusiasm. He's so enthusiastic about working with Vogel. The way Vogel sings and I accompany, the way we seem to be one in such a moment, is something new and unheard of to these people. So obviously they were having a great time working together, and it was something that Schubert may not have experienced before. And this is what we're trying to grapple with. What was that? We also have other descriptions of Vogel singing. This one from his friend, from Walter Duhr, who's actually written an article. And here Duhr says that Vogel freely altered many Lieder, especially those of Die Schöne Müllerin, and he induced the composer to make changes and alterations in his songs when preparing them for publication. So we do have evidence of those changes, ornaments and ornamentation in the songs, and we know that that Schubert agreed to have them published like that. So, and it's interesting also to know that Vogel himself was an Austrian baritone who was praised for his voice and particularly his acting skills, and he became a friend of Schubert's in 1817. One other interesting quote that we could look at is from their friend Leopold von Sonnleithner, who wrote extensively after Schubert's death about Schubert's performance and of Vogel. And he says, the complaint that many Schubert songs do not really completely suit any vocal range has its roots in Vogel's influence. Vogel, and this is the important bit, often produced a momentary effect via a spoken word, a sudden outburst, or a note in falsetto. But these could not be justified artistically or imitated by anyone else. So that's very interesting to read that. And obviously, he's pointing here to a kind of declamatory style, this kind of momentary effect, the spoken word, the outbursts, the falsetto, using all sorts of techniques in the voice and sound to bring across the text. We should also not take too seriously what Sonnleithner says about the fact that these sorts of effects could not be justified. It's been shown now in various research that he was trying to hold Schubert's scores as sacrosanct, and after Schubert's death was trying to stop the sorts of things that actually Vogel was doing in singing. So I think we need to be careful about what he said here. And just one last quote from Joseph von Spaun, who was also part of the circle. And he says that Vogel's classical education made for a more intelligent conception of the poems that were set to music. Through his performances, Vogel created an interest not only in the music, but in the poem as well. And I think that's very important. The poetry, of course, in these performances by Vogel and Schubert was paramount. Bringing across the meaning through the music making was very important. And it feels like Vogel's acting skills really came into play here. So Anna and I have been working on Schubert's Schwanengesang song cycle, which we want to record a little bit down the track. And in preparation for that, we attended this very interesting conference and I can't see it on my screen because my picture's in the way, but here it is. Historical Embodiment in Musical Performance, the Performer's Body as a Tool in Interpretation Research. And this was run by Kai Kerp, who many of you will know and have worked with and heard of, last year in Bern in 2023. Yep. And since then, we presented some of the information we're going to present to you in the next few minutes. And we also drafted a chapter which will be published soonish. I can skip that. I want to launch straight into something that some of you will know and we've played before, but I think is important. So how did an actor reciting some Schubert, for example, in this case, Goethe's Erlkönig, this is the actor, the Austrian actor, Alexander Moisey, how did it sound? What did the actor do to bring out the text? Well, it's great that we have this recording of Moisey, who was born in 1879. He was an Austrian stage actor, and he was amongst the great European stage actors of the early 20th century. This is his take on Erlkönig, and we'll listen to the whole thing because it's really wonderful to listen to.
Wer reitet so spät durch Nacht und Wind? Es ist der Vater mit seinem Kind. Der hat den Knaben wohl in dem Arm, er fasst ihn sicher, er hält ihn warm. Mein Sohn, was birgst du so bang dein Gesicht? Siehst, Vater, du den Erlkönig nicht, den Erlenkönig mit Kron und Schweif? Mein Sohn, es ist ein Nebelstreif. Liebes Kind, komm, geh mit mir, gar schöne Spiele spiel ich mit dir. Manch bunte Blumen sind an dem Strand, meine Mutter hat manch gülden Gewand. Mein Vater, hörst du nicht, was Erlenkönig mir leise verspricht? Sei ruhig, bleibe ruhig, mein Kind, in dürren Blättern säuselt der Wind. Willst, feiner Knabe, du mit mir gehen? Meine Töchter sollen dich warten schön, meine Töchter führen den nächtlichen Rhein und wiegen und tanzen und singen dich an. Mein Vater, siehst du nicht dort, Erlkönigs Töchter am düstern Ort? Mein Sohn, ich seh's genau, es scheinen die alten Weiden so grau. Ich liebe dich, mich reizt deine schöne Gestalt, und bist du nicht willig, so brauch ich Gehalt. Mein Vater, jetzt, fast, hör mich an. Erlkönig hat mir ein Leid getan. Dem Vater grauset's, er reitet geschwind, er hält in den Armen das ächzende Kind, erreicht den Hof mit Mühe und Not. In seinen Armen das Kind war tot.
So, for those who might not have heard that before, it will maybe be surprising to hear an actor using such a range of tonal effects to bring out the different narratives that are going on. We color-coded this so that you could see where the narration changes. And it's clear that there's all sorts of effects, sliding effects, tremolo effects, changes of tempo, changes of rhythm. It's such a wonderful declamation of the text, which really can't be bound in the kind of score notation that we use in music, and it can't be bound into timings and all of those sorts of things. It's kind of really wild in many ways. We could talk about it forever, but we don't have time. I just want to play you just a section of a slightly younger actor from Germany, Will Quadflieg, considered one of Germany's best post-war actors. He's born in 1914, and this was released in 1958. Hearing this gives you a sense of some of the change of aesthetics that even took place in acting and in reciting Erlkönig.
Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Erlkönig. Wer reitet so spät durch Nacht und Wind? Es ist der Vater mit seinem Kind. Er hat den Knaben wohl in dem Arm, er fasst ihn sicher, er hält ihn warm. Mein Sohn, was birgst du so bang dein Gesicht? Siehst, Vater, du den Erlkönig nicht? Den Erlenkönig mit Kron und Schweif? Mein Sohn, es ist ein Nebelstreif. Du liebes Kind, komm, geh mit mir. Gar schöne Spiele spiel ich mit dir. Manch bunte Blumen sind an dem Strand. Meine Mutter hat manch gülden Gewand. Mein Vater, und hörest du nicht, was Erlenkönig mir leise verspricht? Sei ruhig, bleibe ruhig, mein Kind. In dürren Blättern säuselt der Wind.
I'm going to stop that and reshare the screen because that's the only way I can actually stop my PowerPoint because I've set it up that way. So you can hear there that while it's quite an expressive delivery still, it seems to be bound into a sort of tighter framework. It's more in time. It doesn't quite use the same tonal variations and all those sorts of techniques we hear in Moisey. So this goes with the kind of change that happened in the 20th century, and we all know about this. You're all looking at recording techniques over there in that wonderful research that you're undertaking, and we know that these changes took place. So there's not much more to say about that right now. But I would like to play you a version of this Erlkönig sung by Ernestine Schumann-Heynck, who was born in 1861, more or less the same era as Moisey. And I think you'll hear here that she actually captures that declamatory style, even though she's singing and even though she has a piano accompaniment that's quite regular. So let's have a listen to this and we'll come back to this slide. And you will hear immediately that Schumann-Heynck is using the full range of her voice to capture the different characters, and she's using all the tonal effects that we really heard in Moisey, the sliding, the tremolos, the worriedness, the changes of tempo and rhythm are happening quite clearly within the structure of Schubert's music. So there's a correlation between those two things, and this has been real inspiration for us, for Anna particularly, to think about how does someone living now make those sounds, because she wasn't trained necessarily in those same techniques, and we'll hear a bit more in a second. So just recently, we also discovered that another singer, Lily Lehmann, born in 1848, also recorded Erlkönig. She recorded in 1906, and there are very similar traits in her style of singing. So, we have various examples which portray how a singer in this era approached the singing of that song. And we won't listen to that now, but you can always find it on YouTube. So just very, very quickly want to set this idea of a kind of bel canto continuum of practice, which I think really exists between 1700 and 1900. And a continuum is something in which things change and evolve, but there's a kind of similarity that comes down, the same practices, maybe just evolving. And for me, the most important areas that tend to get neglected are the whole areas to do with tempo and rhythm. Now, if we look at C.P. Bach in 1753, the middle of the 18th century, he talks very clearly that one of the most important parts of musical delivery, a successful one, is holding back and pushing forward. So both in rhythm and tempo, that's made clear. In 1835, Louis Spohr says in his violin treatise that an increase of speed is used for furious, impetuous, and passionate passages, a decrease of speed for tender, doleful, or melancholy character. Now, these are the sorts of things in modern performance that are not really allowed to make these types of difference in either tempo or rhythm. Hugo Becker, the famous German cellist in 1929, relates animato to that feeling that makes us talk faster when relating events that affect us very strongly. And meno or più tranquillo checks the flow of the narrative or as a calming effect. And he talks about agogic accentuation as underlining particular places. So accentuation by length to bring out something that's significant. Hummel, in the first movement of his Opus 85 piano concerto, in his Anweisung, actually gives a whole lot of tempo change information between bar 120 to 189. That's about 60 bars. There are that many signals for changing the tempo to bring out the character. And interestingly, he did not put this in the first publication of this piece. The public publication doesn't have these changes of tempo. So he was putting this in here to train students in the art. And if we look at a very influential singing teacher, Manuel Garcia, who really is an inspiration for most of the work we're doing here, in the second part of his École de Garcia of 1847, there are 2 pages devoted to the use of tempo rubato, or the use of changing rhythms and elongating certain notes and speeding up and that sort of thing. This is the French version. Of course, I won't read it all out. You'll see here in this slide in the middle a really complex tempo rubato, which he says his father used to use, and he describes it in ways saying that when the mood suited him, he would lose himself. He'd be abandoned to new rhythms and tempo changes, and he's tried to annotate the changes up there. So the middle stave here shows the types of things that his father would do in performance, which is quite wild by our standards. In the next slide, if you can really summarize what Garcia says about rhythmic alteration. And he says that, of course, it's to create variation of passages containing similar or even notes, intensification of passionate melodies, variation of repeated phrases. You can use tempo rubato to energize final cadences in particular ways that he points out. It emphasizes single notes, appoggiaturas, important syllables, and significant harmonies. And then, interestingly, also can be used to start trills earlier than notated to bring out an enhancement of that moment in music. So there's quite a few things there. And of course, in other treatises, we find other types of rubato and reasons for doing it. I won't go through all of this, but we're talking here about 19th century improvisational expressive practices, which was embodied knowledge for those singers that we hear on early recordings. We've got rhythmic alterations, tempo modification, portamento, tremolo, sliding effects, tremoling effects. And we come to the most important thing that is often neglected with the voice, and I'm going to pass over to Anna, and that's tonal color, register, and timbre. Thanks, Anna.
Good morning, everyone, and good evening here from Australia. Thank you very much for having us. Yes, I'll just talk briefly about these expressive practices, specifically to do with some of the descriptions that Garcia gives in that particular example, the same treatise part that Neal just showed in the previous slide. So these tonal colours, he has compartmentalised in the various editions, starting kind of at 1840, then 47, and then later, these clair, sombre, and the rond. And we as a Discovery team are really sort of focusing on those 3. What I've come to realise more recently is that the clair and the sombre are particularly identified with both the use of the chest register and the head register. And previously I thought maybe there was just kind of more distinction with the clair and the sombre in registers. So say we can kind of over accentuate the darker quality at the bottom of our range and sort of lighten things up more easily. And this is at the top of our range, and that's very much the case. But there is kind of also this sort of transitional area. The rond, in particular, I think is that position for women where we have kind of transitioned from our chest into our head register, and it's actually the central part of our range where we're kind of creating the most beautiful, round, rich sound where our kind of comfort zone exists. And then just below that, I think there is these opportunities, and this is where he starts to describe the mediocrement in 1847, that we sort of start to identify these transitional colors. And this is where we start to look at how the register, this next line here, the register, the equalized or the non-equalized. As a classical singer trained in modern practice, a lot of us have been taught to not accentuate those breaks, keep everything very, very equal across our register, that we're never exposing where that sort of technical change is from our chest to our head, and that would apply also to change voices, to male voices. However, what we're hearing in these early examples, these early recordings, is that they are manipulating or adjusting their larynx and also pharyngeal space to sometimes sort of create these blended sounds that could be potentially in chest register, but kind of lightening up the color or changing the color as it approaches the registral break. And similarly, darkening or altering the color as they come down from the head into the chest. And often they're really accentuating the odd note depending on the trajectory of a melody. And sometimes it sort of results in this sort of technical pop, or what might be described as a yodel, or, you know, like a Tarzan type sort of register leap, and they're doing it quite deliberately depending on what the expressive word is that they would like to accentuate. Back to you,
That's
Neal.
great. And Anna, you might just say something about timbre as well, because this is an area we're grappling with.
And this is, so when Neal and I were revisiting our band presentation, and that was also just post having done the full Schwanengesang set as a performance, we were preparing the paper together, and we started to kind of identify some areas where we were using tonal color and timbre in this sort of quite haphazard way, and we thought, hang on a second, we really need to kind of hone in, and this is still something that we're wanting to clarify. But timbre, and this is where it's difficult because there are translations of the word, you know, in French we have this, which is actual tone color, whereas we use tone color and timbre somehow interchangeably within English, discussions. But from what we kind of perceive, what we're trying to achieve is a quality, a timbre. This is kind of the big picture, and that is actually made up of a combination of things. That it's firstly a breath-related component to the phrase or to the approach to what we're going to actually produce. And then there is, depending on where you are in your register, whether you're in your chest or your head, or transitioning, and then there is actually the resultant tone color that is of all those combinations. So it's not just laryngeal, but also pharyngeal, and all the other soft tissues that are going on, you know, getting excited in the mouth, etc. And that sort of then equals, so it's sort of that plus that equals what we kind of identify as timbre. And if anyone else would like to have a discussion about this, we're very open to it, because it's kind of just a new equation that we're kind of experimenting with. But we're really trying to hone in on exactly what that term means, because it seems to be, a little bit up for debate at our end.
Thanks, Anna. That's great. And I won't mention the other improvisational expressive practices. You can see them there. Okay. Work on this type of reimagining has already been taking place. I worked with Koen van Stade, who's a tenor here, who did a PhD at the Sydney Con a little while ago, and we worked on Schumann's Dichterliebe. We used early recordings to kind of inform our interpretation, and we looked at a range of recordings from different singers, different pianists, that sort of thing. I'll just give you a little burst of the sound world that we've created. I'm playing on a Streicher piano, so one that was known to people like Clara Schumann and Brahms, etc. And Kuhn is experimenting with these vocal techniques that we've been talking about. So just a little bit of this, because there's quite a lot to get through.
Monat Mai, als alle Knospen sprangen, da ist in meinem Herzen die Liebe aufgegangen.
Might just stop that one there. And move on to the next slide, sorry. Just to give you an idea of the kinds of variations that we were listening to in different approaches. So here, for the seventh song, Ich groll nicht, we have the Dutch singer Pelagie Andriessen Grief, born in 1860. And I'll just give you a burst of a couple of recordings.
Aufnahme Deutsche Grammophon AG.
That's a version. And then we have Theresa Beer-Schnabel, born in 1876. She was the wife of Arthur Schnabel, a famous pianist. And she studied with Julius Stockhausen, who was well known to the Schumann-Brahms circle. So there's something of significance here. Quite a different interpretation there, and with a lot of, and both of them have a lot of variation of rhythm and a lot of variation of tempo, and the use of portamento and also vibrato is quite an interesting effect, and also the tonal colors. So here's another version, this time by George Henschel, who is accompanying himself at the piano, and quite a different version, and he was also known to the Schumann-Brahms circle. So we've got lots of different things going on. One there. So quite a different version. We thought about this a lot. We tried different things out and came up with a version that kind of incorporates different elements of those. More, I suppose, like Henschel in a way, but also experimenting with the types of tempo rubato, the not being together, the asynchronies, the different rhythmic changes and things like that. So just a burst, I won't play you the whole of this.
nicht. Und wenn das Herz auch bricht, ewig verlorenes Lieb, ewig verlorenes Lieb, ich grolle nicht, ich grolle nicht, wie du auch strahlst.
I'll stop that there. So you can see the result has elements of all of those recordings in it, and it's just our personal take on it. So it really inspired our imagination in coming to terms with our Dichte Liebe performance. What about reimagining Schubert? What do we do? So just like Schumann, in a way, Schubert's scores were very sparsely marked in terms of expressive indications. There's hardly really anything written in them. So how can we come at a style for Schubert? And also, obviously, we don't have recordings of his favorite singers or of him, and what do we do? So the first thing is we can look at written sources. Now, as part of this research, we've been really lucky. We came across very little known, in fact, an unknown source in Johann Anton Andre, who was the publisher of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart after he died. He bought all of the Nachlass from Constanza, and he had that all published, and that's why we know so much about Mozart. But he was also a composer in his own right, and he composed these wonderful pieces, Lieder und Gesänge, in 4 books in the earlier part of the 19th century, and this has only come to light just recently. He devised in these books his own symbols and signs. Importantly, he says here in the Vorbericht, you can see these R and A, which are ritardando and accelerando, and he places them in the music in specific ways to show which verses and which strophes have them. So that's great. I'll just show you. And what's interesting is that he also published each of the 4 books twice. One in a version that didn't have tempo marks and one in a version that did have tempo marks. So here, for example, we've got book 3, and this is the first song, Liebe, published in 1818 in the first version. You can see it's very interesting because there are no tempo marks apart from the Italian ones at the beginning, but it's littered, absolutely littered with little accent signs, double hairpin signs. You can see how many dynamics there are, for example, in the piano part, forte pianos and decrescendo signs, poco forte, etc. So there's a lot of information, much more than we get in Schubert songs, for example. So we started to look at these. They're around the same time that Schubert's working, and we could garner some really interesting information about performance. In the second version of this from 1818, you can see that he's given us metronome marks just above, between the singer's part and the piano part. And this is really interesting. So we've got the words in translation here. The first 2 bars, which are crotchet 54, strong as the rough hand of death. Then there's an increase of tempo for but stronger still is love, bringing out that emotion. Again, faster 2 bars later, and almost embraces the band of the grave. And then a ritardando marked in the part by his new symbol, but firmer hearts love. And then a little bit later on, at the end of the line, you can see but higher flames and deeper glows gets a further ritardando after the vivace tempo. That this is really interesting information. We would not have garnered this just by thinking about the text. I mean, if you take on board what 19th century writers wrote and they said the tempo should change, that's one thing, but to see it actually notated like this is another. So I'm going to play you a burst of a performance that Anna and I gave at a festival down in Victoria just at the beginning of this year. There's a huge audience sitting and they're clinking their glasses and making lots of noise, so please you have to put up with that. And it's not the greatest sound, but it'll give you an idea of what we came up with in this version.
Stark ist des Todes raue Hand, doch stärker noch ist Liebe. Und fest umwand des Grabes
And I'll just leave it there, sorry, and come back in again. And Anna will Anna, I think we might just not do the Sehnsucht for today because we've got a lot to get through. But I'll show you the music. Here we have another, actually it's short, let's listen to this. Here is another song. Let me just share the screen properly. It's the 9th from the book, a beautiful little one. And you can see again here that Andre has given us tempo indications, and these have been really helpful apart from the Italian tempo marks. So, for example, we start in 120, the lento is kind of half that speed. And interestingly, where the text comes back, where the original text comes back at the end, it's slightly slower than at the beginning. So there are some really subtle changes, and let's just have a listen to this. An absolutely gorgeous song. I'm going to pass over to Anna just to say a few words about what we can learn from that and what she learned from it.
So Andre's Lieder sort of provides a chance to experiment with transitional timbral effects. Many of the melodic lines are written in an area of the vocal range for me which encouraged the exploitation of the tonal shifts. So there's some chromatic and melodic shapes, in particular tritones, that feature but rely on the singer to make decisions about timbre according to articulations that Andre notates. And this is great because it's blank canvas. There's no recordings of these. So it was kind of quite juicy to sort of look at all the expressive markings and decide what to do. So there are many accents and hairpins that you can see, as well as tempo markings, including the Italian terms, which rapidly change over just a few bars. And they all need to be considered and incorporated into the artistic execution. The sobbing and sliding effects and timbral shifts and the accentuation of the registral break are just some of the things that I added in as bel canto effects. The songs offer opportunities to feature what may sound like a yodel, but is actually a sort of mechanical shift in tonal colors across the registral break. So this sort of affords an interim passing note as an opportunity to sort of implement the voix sombre, the voix claire, the mediocrement tonal colors facilitated by a flexible laryngeal position. And these sort of effects are supported by Manuel Garcia's singing treatise. So also text breaks, making them more cellular as shapes and little phrases, recitative and parlando sections. You know, within such a tiny song, there are so many little sort of compartmentalized phrases that sort of varies the approach to the text, and the tempo rubato can be utilized to enhance spoken and textual qualities. And then some of the hairpins on falling phrases and isolated hairpins on singular words are sort of accentuated on words such as leider by sort of elongating the initial voice consonant, as well as accentuating the transition of the diphthong, the transitional vowels for added tonal color. So you sort of get that harmonic shift, highlighting the distressed attributes of the text in words such as vice or longing.
Thank you, Anna. That's fantastic. So having got the Andre information, which really helped us so much with things like what do we do with rhythm and tempo, and as Anna's explained, the timbral shifts that she was able to bring to it. That's great, and obviously brings us closer to the kind of Schubertian, the early 19th century. Another source of written information, which was very important that we discovered, is from Franz Liszt, who actually made transcriptions of many of Schubert's songs, and particularly of Schwanengesang. It's great to see that he'd done that, and we could have a look at it. Liszt studied it with Carl Czerny in Vienna, and returned to Vienna in 1838 and became very well acquainted with Schubert's music, really loved it, and decided that he needed to put Schubert on the map. And one way he could do that was to make these arrangements. I'm just going to go on. So here we have the title page. Around 1840, he goes earnestly into production of these arrangements. And we discovered, looking at it, that these are like an instructive edition. They're full of annotated words and signs of expression that elicit tempo and rhythmic agogic flexibility, even give us a sense of a varied timbral color for the singer from what he writes in the part. And these obviously underpin the text and the word painting. And so we decided to do a bit of a reverse engineering exercise, which we found could assist in enhancing Schubert's quite plain score. So sort of taking that expression from Liszt and putting it back into Schubert. And this proved to be really interesting, an interesting way of going it. So here we've got in this slide the first song, Liebesbotschaft, and you can see immediately, here's Schubert's accompaniment, for example, at the beginning, you can see how Liszt embellishes it with these much larger chords in the left-hand played arpeggio. He gives us indications like una corda, dolce tranquillamente, and then you can see when the vocal line comes in, he's actually giving articulations that go with the words, but also lots of information about the type of feeling that this song should have. Now, one might think, well, what has Liszt got to do with Schubert? But Liszt was living in Vienna at the time that these songs were being sung. It's very likely that he heard singers who knew Schubert, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, it's very important that we take on these sources of information when we're trying to reimagine the past. If we look at some of the things that Liszt did, here we have bar 26, and you can see in Schubert's version, we've got this double hairpin here contained within the bar, and it's obviously pointing out the word Glut. Here in Liszt's version, he extends the double hairpin, so it becomes a much larger event. And of course, I haven't got time to go into this, but of course, double hairpins had special significance in the 19th century. They indicated changes of tempo, so crescendo getting faster, diminuendo getting slower, but also the apex of the hairpin, the bit in between, could be elongated. The double hairpin was used to sort of create extra expression to show bit of music that was very, very important. You also have here Liszt adding in poco rit and in tempo. So he's really trying to emphasize these changes of dynamic. At bar 31, Schubert gives us pianissimo, nothing much else. Liszt tells us to go slower, really, immediately slower and in sotto voce. So there's a whole lot of interesting information that's in these versions. At the very end of this song, of course, Liszt has tampers. He can't just have the plain chord. He adds in a little cadenza, which is really super, which of course fits in with what we know of 19th century pianism, that chords like these that are long would often have an improvisation on them, or they would be arpeggiated in interesting sorts of ways, up and down sometimes. So this all gave us incredible fodder for our imagination. And we embodied Liszt's, I'm just got to move my little marker here. It gave us ways of thinking about the text, Rellstab's texts in this case, and how Liszt's descriptions fit with that text. And also it gave us a chance to implement previous embodied knowledge of 19th century and earlier expressive practices and notions of style to realize imaginatively Liszt's annotations in sound. So we're going to just play you a few excerpts from this. This is Liebesbotschaft, and Anna very kindly went through and marked on top of Schubert the markings that Liszt actually provides.
Rush
so funny when you listen back to things that you've done. That was the beginning of a concert in that festival concert, and I can feel myself playing too fast. So you'll have to excuse that. But what wonderful singing from Anna! It's just amazing. So we are going to run a little bit out of time, but the other approach to our Schwannengesang comes from embodying early recorded evidence and using recording emulation, so imitation and previous embodied knowledge to come at it. Anna, I just want to ask you, sorry, should we play the stension? Would you like that?
As you like, Neal.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we'll just play one example of this and then we'll give our conclusions. But we have this wonderful recording by German dramatic soprano Johanna Gadsky singing Stenchen, which is one of the songs from, it's a very famous one from the Schwannengesang. And so let's just listen a little. It's a very crackly recording, but it's a really interesting one. We might stop that there. And Anna, you might take over and talk about your approach and also about the various signs that you've come up with.
So it was very interesting listening to these individual recordings and sort of meticulously annotating through the close listening every expressive detail. And you'll see that on my score, including the fine oscillations of Gadsky's vibrato usage, so that we sort of can make connections with how the effect's working, whether that's kind of slightly straighter depending on the area of the range that she's singing in, but there's predominantly less vibrato. So I have this color-coded system of annotations with the key to compartmentalize much of the subtle nuance and to sort of distinguish between the effects and the rate of the usage. And it was sort of Gadsky's rendition compared to other early recording examples of the same leads that seemed to showcase the most variation in timbre across her range, with clear distinctions between earthy chest qualities and the transitional colors through to her sort of warm, rich head voice, that voix ronde I talked about before, and then further extensions into the sort of light, bright, controlled upper register, which she does these sort of magical sort of piano sort of top notes and this sort of crystalline. The decorative detail, including many sliding effects, which also feature sort of falling tremolos. I think that's distinctly different from how vibrato is produced, as sort of this sort of emotional effect on a slide. So the more challenging aspect of the embodiment process was to find a good balance between all the expressive qualities of Gadsky's. So I added up to the score many more sliding effects and the use of a straighter tone than modern singers would generally employ, and then adhere to the additional layers of expressive detail, yet still engineer the leader to sound fluid and natural, essentially a self-devised and complementary to sort of my own artistic sentiment.
That's wonderful.
So you can see on this page. Yeah, exactly. So you can see on this page the key to the annotations, and I will revisit this because now I've sort of got a better understanding. But I sort of devised the sort of chest and the head as heart and circle, and this sort of voix claire, which is sort of distinctly sort of clear and sparkly at the top. And then sort of through the process, I discovered this sort of mixed voice, this sort of diamond area where it's sort of very much this sort of mediocrement, which could be sort of chest with a bit of head quality, or predominantly sort of head register with a bit of chest quality. So I'm sort of still exploring that, and that's very sort of repertoire dependent, as well as specifically sort of range depending on how you're transitioning over particular phrases. Sometimes it's just a note or two that sort of you adopt this particular sort of color registral blend.
That's great. And that's just a slide that talks about all of that. we just give you a few seconds of what we came up with in this particular performance. And of course, we just add, this is early days when we recorded this at the festival, and lots of things have changed since then. You might just stop there. Sorry. I have to just do that every time I change out of these. And we won't play this for you, but just to let you know that we also looked at another song, Aufenthalt, and we used a wax recording from 912 of a baritone, of all things, of Lev Sibiryakov. And Anna, just briefly, if you want to say how that was for you, because obviously this was in Russian and it's a baritone, how did you adapt what you heard?
So a challenging thing to interpret the Russian and sort of translate all the information. But what presented itself, sort of just looking beyond the Russian, was actually some very clearly defined sort of color options that Lev was actually presenting, sort of quite dark, rich colors at the bottom and sort of floating all these wonderful top register stuff. So it was great to be able to sort of put the two concepts together again in another scenario, and sort of envisage what I could do, because I can definitely not be a baritone, even though I was kind of a bit this morning. Learning some exercises for a baritone. Anyway, yes, interesting exercise.
Great. So we're really running out of time. So I think we should probably conclude that you've kind of really got, just let me share that again, and I'm going to move on. So yeah, Tuak, I just want to make sure we were at the end. So just to round off, the methodologies that we've outlined in this presentation can, we think, assist in breaking the bonds of modernist singing and pianistic expectations, and to rediscover the sounds of 19th century and earlier bel canto styles and expressions. And the level of expressive shadings that were expected of singers and instrumentalists before the 20th century is shown to be really exceptional compared with current expectations. The analysis that we've done, for example, of Moisey, of Schumann, Heinck, of Gadsky, of Sibiryakov, and many others, and the myriad dynamic and temporal descriptions that we saw in instructive scores such as by Andre and Liszt, provide hard evidence that lieder performance, and I would say also all sorts of other singing performances in the 19th century, going back to the era of Schubert and Vogel, had little to do with simply a beauty of sound, as that has come to be understood nowadays. Put in another way, beauty of sound encapsulated far more than just perfect intonation, correct notes, long sustained lines, or meticulous realization of the composer's score markings. This knowledge has certainly set a new context for unraveling our learned modernist ways of presenting historical musics, acknowledging the continuum of practice that shaped performance in the 19th century and earlier. Anna, you take over from me now.
So I found that these early recordings, and Neal's the same, are indispensable in the process of rediscovering 19th century bel canto. So in the same way that they have been for instrumental practice. So there's this window into the past, providing an audible key to unlocking the knowledge of historical singing practices and styles. So Gadsky and Schumann Heink, this evidence is a plethora of 19th century expressive effects they employed to underscore textual meaning and to claim text through singing. So we've heard all those things, the tempo rubato, the modifications, the sliding, in very sort of distinctly, noticeably less vibrato, say in opera or lieder. But sort of equal significance is their ever-changing timbres, which are entirely sort of text-driven. And these singers had no compunction in using the whole range of their vocal color, the whole palette, including the weaker, unstable sounds in registral break regions, to actually accentuate the sort of fragility of some words, or even kind of the sentiment of the whole song. So this equalization of the registers is not a constant in their singing, rather it's merely one of the many effects that they employed. So imitating and embodying these declamatory singing techniques, and those in piano playing as well, paves the way for practice-led processes that can help to sonify the historical written evidence in historically appropriate ways and extrapolate vocal and pianistic declamatory styles going back further from the Schubert era. And the most challenging aspect of the embodiment process is finding successful balance between implementing new or unfamiliar expressive possibilities and negotiating these in ways that sound fluid and natural and not studied. We don't want to really hear that in any sort of live performance, that people are still counting or sort of really kind of being quite marked with their use of devices. So it wants to essentially sound self-devised and complementary to one's own artistic sentiment. So embodying the practices, singing on these records, require two things: close imitation to expand the armory of expression available in our current practice, and then that sort of metamorphosis, that sort of natural sense of a living musician feels. And we have to sort of adopt the dead musician's practices in our own body and allow these to sound anew as our own. So such metamorphosis provides a visceral connection with the past and opens up sort of portals to understanding of those earlier worlds of Schubert and Vogel, and fosters this artistic experimentation with the remnant evidence of the historical practice. It's quite thrilling and exciting, sort of doing all the investigative work. So it's we're kind of really aiming for beautiful, declamatory, and quite individual.
And I think we'll just finish on that note. So I'd like to thank Anna for joining me today, and also for this opportunity to tell you about the sort of work that we're doing here in Sydney, and that we want to share with and find out from you what you're doing, and make this world of singing and piano playing even more robust and more interesting. So thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, Neal.
Thank you.
And Anna.
Thank you. As ever.
As you can